After the smash success of the original Super Mario Bros. Platforming game in 1985, which made Nintendo a household name, audiences in the Eastern and Western hemispheres had very different experiences with Mario over the next few years. In Japan, the immediate follow-up to Super Mario Bros. Was what we in the US now refer to as the Lost Levels. This graphically updated, though otherwise remarkably similar title, introduced a few new features to the franchise, such as Luigi's longer jump, as well as the downsizing poison mushroom, though it was overall deemed too frustratingly difficult for a worldwide release. In the United States, and later on Europe and Australia, consumers received, in place of an original Mario title, a reskinned platformer that had been released in Japan as Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, translating to Dream Factory Heart-Pounding Panic. Interestingly enough, Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto actually had more involvement in the development of Doki Doki Panic than in the Lost Levels, which is what led to the former becoming a part of Mario history. Despite the reasonable success it saw in the West, Super Mario Bros. 2 was occasionally critiqued as feeling starkly different from its predecessor. So, following a frustratingly difficult Japanese release and a Western game that hadn't begun as a true Mario project, the third title would serve as a more faithful follow-up for a worldwide market, with Nintendo confidently planting their feet in the next step of Mario's timeline. Super Mario Bros. 3 was developed by Nintendo's Research and Development No. 4 department, which had previously focused on all major entries of Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda up to that point, and was led once again by co-directors Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. At first, the game was intended to be experienced from an isometric point of view, though it was relinquished to the earlier side-scrolling format of its predecessors in order to better convey character placement during jumps. The checkered floor on the title screen is actually a remnant of this earlier isometric perspective. Miyamoto has stated that the third Super Mario entry was conceived as a stage play. This is why a curtain rises as the game begins, and why many pieces of the game's stages are seen to be bolted to the background or hanging from wires, even casting shadows on what could be presumed to be a sky but is actually a backdrop. Super Mario Bros. 3 received universal acclaim upon release, with nearly unanimous praise as an overall achievement in the world of gaming due to its high-quality visuals and sound design, addictive and challenging gameplay, and overall degree of fun. Even releasing 3 years later in Europe in 1991, Super Mario Bros. 3 was still compared favorably to Sega's next-generation platformer, Sonic the Hedgehog. Upon release in Japan, Super Mario Bros. 3 became one of the best-selling games for several years, vying for the top of the charts with Dragon Quest III and later on, Tetris. By 1993, Super Mario Bros. 3 had sold 4 million units. However, this even managed to be overshadowed by the game's response in North America. Before release, the game had been revealed and promoted through the 1989 film The Wizard, generating a high degree of anticipation just 2 months before the game's release. Within its first year on the shelves, American audiences purchased more than 8 million copies, generating a modern equivalent of over $1.2 billion. By the year 2000, over 17 million copies had been sold worldwide, making Super Mario Bros. 3 the highest-grossing video game outside of those bundled with consoles until the year 2011, 23 years after its initial release in Japan. Countless journalists and critics in the gaming world have since placed Super Mario Bros. 3 very close to the top of any lists discussing the greatest video games of all time, with the game often being recognized for its historic cultural impact as well. There's a lot to consider when analyzing this deceptively simple yet revolutionary video game, so let's jump right in and discuss what's so great about Super Mario Bros. 3. The very first screen after the player hits start is incredibly inviting, with hills bouncing to the swung overworld music and Mario pacing as if he's ready to go. This unique level select menu also makes sense to most anyone who's played a board game before, with levels that connect directly to each other, as well as bonus tiles, obstacles, and branching paths to introduce some player choice and strategy. The player's objective is also clear, with a flashing help sign over a large and distinct castle space. Rather than stages being presented in consecutive fashion as they're completed, the levels in Super Mario Bros. 3 are actually laid out across what I believe is the first instance of a navigable overworld or hub world within a platforming game. The map of each world displays the various action stages that the player can or must complete to reach their goal, but also shows the locations of bonus stages, shortcuts, and even enemies that move around the map themselves. The levels don't all have to be completed in any particular sequence, but in order to reach each world's final castle, the player has to clear stages in order to forge a path for themselves through the Mushroom World. Just as in the first Super Mario Bros., this entry has 8 worlds to overcome before reaching Bowser. However, this time they're much more heavily personified and differentiated. The overworlds are all very cleverly laid out to leave intriguing reveals for new players as they discover the unpredictably varied paths that lead to each land's final castle. Each world also has its own overworld tune to differentiate them as much as their visual aesthetics. The first world, Grassland, introduces players to the unfamiliar concept of slopes as well as several new enemies such as the Paragoomba. We also learn that some returning enemies have been updated with new abilities, such as the fact that some piranha plants can now aim and spit fire at the player. The fourth level in World 1 features the brand new, state-of-the-art auto-scrolling level. Auto-scrolling was far from a new concept in video games, with plenty of standard space shooters like Gradius continuously moving the player through a pre-generated environment, though with no real impact on the gameplay aside from encouraging the player not to crash into something. In the platforming genre, the inclusion of a stage that moves at one set speed introduces a unique challenge in the face of Mario's usual go-at-your-own-pace format. Even if players are proficient at platforming games, reaching the front end of the screen, so to speak, and not knowing what comes next forces more hurried players to cater to the whim of the stage's designers, preparing for unknown obstacles with very little time to respond. Due to the unique challenge that this stage presents to returning Mario fans, it's also presented within the first optional branch of the game's new layout, so it can be avoided by players who haven't quite gotten a handle on the controls and need more time on stages that move at their own pace. In later instances of auto-scrolling levels, additional challenges such as falling platforms, icy surfaces, and diagonal scrolling are added to increase the difficulty within the confines of a strictly paced stage. World 2, Desert Land, introduces plenty of environmental hazards, including quicksand, camouflaged enemies, and even a violent sun. Water now exists within the game as something that Mario can jump in and out of, often many times within the same stage, rather than a strictly designated quote-unquote water level, as was in the first Super Mario Bros. This change is highlighted in World 3, Waterland, where players may also get a chance to try the new frog suit. The water world does feature aquatic stages that feel like the same ones featured in the original Super Mario Bros., though now spanning multiple screens up and down, allowing slightly more freedom in exchange for the limited mobility underwater. The last few worlds of the game continue to feature environmental themes, such as ice and skylands, as well as more abstract designs based around the Mario universe as it had been established thus far. These include the maze-like Pipeland and the size-changing Giant Land, both elaborating on very prominent features of Mario gameplay since there have been Mario games to play. Every individual stage also becomes larger and larger as the game continues, quickly dwarfing the horizontally limited origins of the series, as players are expected to discover for themselves the interesting ways they'll need to navigate each level throughout this platforming odyssey. Our hero himself, Mario, has been updated with a new design that makes him a little more stout, though also more highly detailed than his previous appearances. Control-wise, Mario feels a little floatier than in the first Super Mario Bros., though once you adapt to it, this sensation winds up providing a much greater sense of control on the ground, underwater, and even in the air. Mario also moves quite a bit faster overall, and can more easily integrate his momentum into jumping distance, making it easier than ever to reach Mario's maximum jump height without a whole run-up. Unlike the first title, taking damage at your most powerful, for instance with a Fire Flower, no longer knocks the player all the way down to Mario's smallest form, but rather down to a full-sized Super Mario, granting players the ability to take damage basically equal to the number of power-ups they've collected. Extra coins and bonus lives were made much more prevalent in the game's earlier worlds to accommodate players with less developed skills, so that they didn't have to go searching for these bonuses as thoroughly as had been required in Mario & Luigi's earlier adventures. At the end of each stage, the player will collect one of 3 cards from a roulette. No matter which combination they get, collecting all 3 cards without getting a game over will grant the player a bonus life, with 2, 3, or 5 bonus lives being given away if the player can match 3 of each card type between levels. Giving the player at least 1 bonus life for every 3rd stage completed gives additional incentive to return to other branches of the map that you had circumvented earlier whenever you're running out of lives on the last couple stages of that world. Two additional bonus stages will occasionally appear on the world map, being a slot machine game in which the player tries to line up the face of a symbol, and a memory game involving flipping cards. Both of these games offer the player even more chances to collect extra lives, alongside the toad houses in each world where bonus items and power-ups can be claimed. Up to 28 consumable items can now be collected and hoarded, waiting to be used whenever the player wishes from the overworld screen. These include items to be used in the next level, such as the Fire Flower or Tanuki suit, as well as items that actually allow the player to move differently about the overworld map, such as the Hammer, which clears a roadblock, or Yugum's Cloud, which allows players to skip a level altogether. Raccoon Mario and Tanuki Mario can both fly after gaining enough momentum and taking a bounding leap. The tail of these suits, aside from functioning as a melee weapon, can be used to break blocks directly next to the player, as well as slow Mario's descent after a jump. Tanuki Mario specifically can prevent damage while stationary by turning into a statue. The other new animal form would be Frog Mario, who can swim and navigate around underwater obstacles like the blooper with much more ease than before. In tandem with the player's many abilities at hand, there are an overwhelming array of new block types that the player can interact with, instead of the usual bricks and mystery blocks that just need to be jumped into from below. Now, there are bricks that can be picked up by both the player and certain enemies, coins and creatures frozen within ice cubes that can be thawed by a fireball, as well as platforms that change direction as the player jumps on them. In fact, one floating platform in this game is a type of enemy themselves. The new jump blocks, which feature a music note printed on the front, are generally indestructible under normal circumstances and allow the player to bounce off of them for some added lift. On top of the player abilities and platform types, Super Mario Bros. 3 also introduces dozens of new enemies to the Mario universe, many of which have since become fan favorites and been prominently featured in other Nintendo titles throughout the years. Just a few of these include the dog-inspired Chain Chomp, the spiked ball regurgitating dinosaur Spike, and the shy, player-chasing ghost Boo Diddley. We also get a few new variations on returning foes, such as the Dry Bones, the skeletonized Koopa, as well as the Boomerang, Fire, and Heavy variants of the Hammer Brothers, who roam around the overworld map as additional threats. Each world features at least one mini-fortress at its halfway point, which is guarded by a new Bowser lackey named Boom Boom. Defeating him will open the locked doors in that kingdom to allow for a checkpoint and possible shortcut, depending on which levels have and have not been cleared. Some of the larger worlds have more than one miniature fortress to provide extra checkpoints. The old castle stage theme that used to punctuate each world in the original Super Mario Bros. Has now been expanded into Boom Boom's realm. These strongholds are now much less claustrophobic and feature animated lava and much more grand architecture, complete with tall windows and high ceilings. Boom Boom himself becomes more powerful with each encounter, eventually learning to jump and fly to make later fights more difficult. For example, the second time you fight Boom Boom, he learns how to jump. Later on, he'll speed up, sprout wings, and change the layout of his lair to attempt to overtake the player at their next duel. At the end of each world, instead of the traditional castles, are now much more dynamic airship stages lorded over by the Koopalings, and centered around the newly introduced feature of auto-scrolling. The 7 Koopalings who work for Bowser and make up this entry's major bosses were designed by Miyamoto to reflect individual members of his development staff. Their names were determined by Nintendo of America as references to famous musicians, such as Lemmy Kilmister and Iggy Pop. The original manual refers to the Koopalings as Bowser's children, though Nintendo has retconned this as them being his non-related underlings. Plot-wise, the Koopalings have each stolen the magic wand from one of the 7 kingdoms in Mushroom World, and have turned each country's king into an animal. In order to turn them back, Mario must recover the stolen wand by boarding every Koopaling's heavily armed battleship and defeating them in a close-quarters fight. If the player fails to complete the airship stage on their first attempt, it will actually fly to another space on that world's map, possibly forcing the player to complete another level to reach it if they previously used any shortcuts. The inclusion of these airships, as well as fortresses, tanks, and a seemingly endless fleet of underlings, makes Bowser feel like a true villain bent on domination, instead of just a large turtle in charge of some smaller turtles. The fact that we face off against Boom Boom and the Koopalings throughout the first 7 worlds means we don't even know what Bowser looks like in this entry, or what he's now capable of until we're finally face to face with him. Only a couple years after Nintendo had revolutionized home gaming with their first killer app on the NES, Super Mario Bros., they returned with another game that would epitomize the platforming genre, arguably until the introduction of a third dimension. Super Mario Bros. 3, while featuring the same challenge and format as many other video games, that being get from one platform to the other without falling or taking damage, managed to do it in a way that was continuously fun and engaging. The world is interesting, the characters and abilities are interesting, and even many of the platforms themselves are interesting. With the use of unique worlds and massively varied environmental threats and enemies, Super Mario Bros. 3 was the first platformer game to really take its players on a whole adventure. In contrast to the usual format, of which the previous Mario games had been contributors, of simply challenging audiences with one level after the other of slightly different A to B obstacle courses of jumping between platforms. Countless video games have since followed the elemental world formula, or something similar, with a player beginning their journey in a land of sunny levels with green grass, then moving on to harsher and harsher lands, almost always including a desert, ocean, and ice stage, along with a few unique ones depending on the game's universe. Sonic the Hedgehog, Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro the Dragon, even up to more modern and independent titles like Super Meat Boy. Basically, every platformer game in the next couple generations of hardware that featured multiple worlds all borrowed inspiration from the format of Super Mario Bros. 3, because it works so well for slowly introducing new, more complex mechanics to the player, while keeping things aesthetically interesting with wildly diverse settings, from the colors and music to the enemies and hazards. This game's overworld and stage layout, while inspiring countless other games down the line, was also adapted into the interconnected map layout for Super Mario World, and is virtually identical to the modern format used for the new Super Mario Bros. Series, which has had an entry on all Nintendo hardware since the Wii and Nintendo DS. Aside from the fact that they were only released a few years apart, Super Mario Bros. 3 hardly even seems like it was designed for the same console as the first game in the trilogy. By contrast, the third game almost looks as if it's a 16-bit title compared to the flat, plain aesthetic of the Mario Bros. First big adventure. In the third entry, characters are much more highly detailed, every stage within every world is much larger and more complex, and there are far more features and challenges that combine to create completely understandable, yet constantly fresh platforming challenges, without even needing to add any clashing sort of action or puzzle elements in order to mix things up. That is what's so great about Super Mario Bros. 3. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we discuss the historic impact of Super Mario Bros. 3. If you want to support the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and do whatever else the algorithm demands of us to keep up with our favorite content. Also, consider being a part of the community on Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Thief the Dark Project, on screen or in the description. And let us know your thoughts on Mario 3 and what games you'd like to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.